This is an AQA Psychology A-level revision video for the paper 1 topic of psychopathology with a specific focus on OCD. So let's have a look at where OCD sits into the bigger picture according to the specification. So you are expected to know the behavioural, emotional and cognitive characteristics of obsessive compulsive disorder, OCD, as well as the biological approach to explaining and treating OCD. That is the genetic and neural explanations and drug therapy. So you have to pay careful attention to the wording of the spec, because if they gave you a question specifically about drug therapy, then we'll be expecting you to know that that is the biological approach to treating OCD. So it's really important that you recognise that term of drug therapy. So to begin with this session, we need to consider what the behavioural, emotional and cognitive characteristics of OCD are. So that is, how does a person with OCD act, how do they feel, and what do they think? So this is an opportunity to pause the video, have a think about what the characteristics might be. Just bear in mind there are only 2 behavioural characteristics instead of 3 for OCD. So if you pause the video in 5 seconds, I will talk you through the characteristics. So the behavioural characteristics of OCD are repetitive behaviours, repetitive compulsions, and they are done to reduce anxiety. So repetitive and reduce are crucial here. Also avoidance, a bit like in phobias, that carries over here, but to avoid the situations that trigger anxiety. So avoiding germs or avoiding mess. And then the emotional characteristics are anxiety and distress, depression, and guilt and disgust, with the cognitive characteristics consisting of cognitive strategies such as hypervigilance, so being super on edge and paying a lot of attention to your environment, being very vigilant, being very aware, having obsessive thoughts. So if you notice, obsessions are the cognitive characteristic, compulsions are the behavioural characteristic, and then finally an awareness that their behaviour is irrational. So the cognitive characteristic there is crucial. People with OCD recognise that the sort of irrationality of their obsessions and compulsions. However, because it is an anxiety disorder, they feel they have to perform them to reduce that emotional anxiety and distress. So moving on now to the explanations of OCD. You are expected to know and evaluate the biological explanation of OCD, that is genetic and neural explanations. So before we get into that, we're going to have a look at the main assumptions of the biological approach. So this is an opportunity for you to check your knowledge of the biological approach. If you pause the video in 5 seconds, we will go through some of the main assumptions. Okay, so the really key main assumption of the biological approach is this belief that everything psychological is at first biological. And I always stress that because they investigate how any biological structure can be linked to behaviour. And this belief that most of human behaviour does have a physiological cause, which can be genetically or environmentally altered. So behaviours can come from your genetics, they can come from your hormones, they can come from different parts of the brain. So genes affect behaviour, and evolutionary psychology consider how genetics influence common behaviours, survival of the fittest, what behaviours get reproduced and passed on, and the nervous system as well as the brain, and also other systems within the body, so the endocrine system for your hormones. So moving on now to the genetic explanations of OCD. OCD is polygenic. Now that word polygenic is important here. So there is more than one specific gene that has been linked to OCD, therefore suggesting there is a genetic component to OCD, not necessarily that ultimately causes it, but certainly predisposes individuals to OCD. And Taylor in 2013 carried out a meta-analysis, so that large-scale study compiling lots of different research, and found actually there's as many as 230 different genes involved in OCD, And that point there by Taylor is crucial for AO3, which we'll visit later on in this video. So moving specifically on to genetic explanations, you need to be aware of candidate genes. So because OCD is polygenic, you need to recognise that actually some specific genes have been linked to OCD. And the two candidate genes that you can use to explain your knowledge of genetic explanations for OCD are the COMT and the SERT gene. So the COMT gene produces COMT, and the role of COMT is to regulate the production of dopamine. So COMT is linked to the neurotransmitter dopamine. One form of the COMT gene has been found to be more common in people with OCD. So there's a link there between that specific variation of the COMT gene and OCD. And this specific variation produces lower activity of the COMT gene and therefore higher levels of dopamine, because of course the job of COMT is to regulate the production. So if there's a variation that produces lower activity, that means less regulation of dopamine and therefore higher levels. You've then got the SERT gene, and this one's nice and easy to remember because it is involved in the transport of serotonin, and again it leads to lower levels of serotonin, which are linked to OCD, and we'll visit this in more detail when we look at the neural explanations. So there's a bit of a crossover here with the genetic and the neural explanations. So one study has found a mutation of this gene in 2 unrelated families, and 6 of the 7 family members had OCD. So there's a clear link there between the SERT gene, serotonin, and OCD. When we look at some evidence into the genetic explanations, we've got twin studies. Now, these twin studies have identified concordance rates, so that is the percentage of similarity between identical twins, which are your MZ twins, and your non-identical twins, which are your DZ twins. And the percentage is considerably higher amongst identical twins of 68% compared to non-identical twins of 31%. So these concordance rates, the fact that the MZ twins are showing higher concordance than DZ twins, would suggest that there is a genetic component, as MZ twins share 100% of their genes. Their DNA is exactly the same. So the fact that the concordance rate is higher in those identical twins suggests that there must be a genetic component. However, when we think about the challenge question here, actually there's drawback in that the concordance rates for MZ is not 100%. So there's other factors besides DNA that affect whether someone gets OCD or not. And that leads nicely into considering strengths and weaknesses of the genetic explanation of OCD. So this is your opportunity to pause the video, and in 5 seconds we will look over some of the evaluation points. Okay, so your strengths here are evidence. The twin studies that we've just looked at, the 68% compared to 31%, is evidence for the genetic element of OCD. And also the evidence that shows that there must be a genetic vulnerability towards OCD because of those specific candidate genes that have been identified. However, there might be better explanations, such as social learning theory, because the argument is that if OCD is genetic, you can't actually untangle the effects of the environment, and that it could be that they've observed and imitated the behaviour and then have gone on to develop OCD themselves. Also, another reason it's difficult to untangle the effects of the environment and genes is because of the study by Chroma 2007, where over half of OCD patients had experienced a traumatic event in the past, and that they sort of linked the cause of their OCD to that trauma. Also, OCD was more severe in those with more than one trauma that had experienced another trauma in their life. So maybe actually we should be focusing on environmental causes rather than solely genetic, because OCD can clearly not be just genetic. And furthermore, linking back to that point earlier, as I said, would return to, there's lots of genes involved, too many as 230, so it's really difficult to pinpoint and to say and to argue that genetics is the only explanation for OCD. which moves on now to the neural explanations of OCD, looking at brain structure, so specific brain areas, and brain chemistry, your neurotransmitters. So I mentioned earlier about the SERT gene and the COMP gene, which have a role in terms of dopamine and serotonin. But when we're talking about the neural explanations, we want to move away from genetics. So to focus on the neurotransmitters, you've got serotonin. Low levels of serotonin are linked to OCD, and antidepressants that increase serotonin have been found to reduce the symptoms of OCD, whereas antidepressants that have less effect on serotonin and maybe target other neurotransmitters have no effect on OCD symptoms. So there's clearly a link there between the neurotransmitter serotonin and OCD. Furthermore, serotonin is a neurotransmitter that is linked to the ability to provide self-control in your own behaviour, to control your impulsions and compulsions and impulsive behaviour. So maybe those low levels of serotonin can also explain the compulsions in OCD. There's also research that suggests dopamine, another neurotransmitter, is high in individuals with OCD, higher than the average person. And this comes from animal studies that gave high doses of drugs to increase the dopamine, and this created movements resembling that of OCD in animals. So maybe repetitive tapping, etc. Behaviours that demonstrate that they can't control their own behaviour, those compulsions. So that's the role of brain chemistry and neurotransmitters. Moving on to brain structure and brain areas. If you have a little look at this image here, what you can see is the brain of someone without OCD on the left compared to the brain of someone with OCD. And what they've got here is heightened activity in the brain, and this is revealed through PET scans, particularly the orbital frontal cortex and the caudate nucleus. Now, those are two really important brain areas that we're going to look at in more detail. So this is your opportunity to pause the video and just note down orbital frontal cortex and the caudate nucleus, because you want to be able to articulate how they are linked to OCD. So what research has shown and what we understand about the OFC, the orbital frontal cortex, is that it is the part of the brain that notices when something is wrong. It helps us to make decisions and manage appropriate decisions in our behaviour. So the OFC might register that there's dirt nearby, and dirt would send a worry signal to the thalamus, another part of the brain. The thalamus's job is to direct signals from many different parts of the brain to the appropriate place, somewhere that can interpret the signal. So in this case, the signal gets sent back to the orbital frontal cortex, because the job of the orbital frontal cortex is to make decisions. So the thalamus directs that signal back to the orbital frontal cortex. However, the caudate nucleus, which is another part of the brain, is situated in between the OFC and the thalamus, and that regulates signals that are sent between the OFC and the thalamus. So when the thalamus receives a worry signal, it gets excited. It sends signals back to the OFC, which can interpret them and choose an appropriate response. However, in the non-OCD person, the caudate nucleus's job is to act like a brake pedal. It's to suppress the worry signal. It's to say, yeah, it's just a bit of dirt. Hold on, brain. Don't get too excited. So the thalamus doesn't get hyperactive and it doesn't send alarming signals to the orbital frontal cortex. But with someone with OCD, the caudate nucleus is thought to be damaged. So it can't apply the brakes. It cannot suppress those signals from the orbital frontal cortex, and it can't stop the thalamus getting overexcited. So the thalamus becomes overexcited, which causes the thalamus to send strong signals back to the orbital frontal cortex, causing the orbital frontal cortex to panic and go, right, the decision you need to make about this dirt is one of compulsive and anxious behaviour. So it increases that compulsions and those anxieties, repetitive and pointless rituals, maybe senseless rituals that non-OCD patients would sort of call that, and it causes obsessive compulsive behaviour in people with OCD. So that is the neural explanation of OCD. Moving on now to think of some strengths and weaknesses for the neural explanation. Opportunity now to pause the video and think of some strengths and weaknesses. In 5 seconds, we will look at the answers. Okay, so one strength of the neural explanations is the supporting evidence. By Hume in 2006 compared serotonin activity in 169 people with OCD compared to 253 without OCD and found serotonin to be lower in those with OCD, therefore supporting the link between low levels of serotonin and OCD. The next really good strength is that it's led to the development of treatments. It's led to drug therapy, which is the next thing we are about to look at in this video after the evaluation. So SSRIs are used to treat OCD and have been found to be successful. Sumro in 2009 found SSRIs were more effective than placebos, so a fake drug, a sugar pill, in reducing symptoms of OCD, which shows the benefit of this research. It's really important we understand the neural mechanisms because we've been able to create drug therapies and to improve people's quality of life. However, the supporting evidence shows a link, a correlation, therefore no cause and effect. It's not causal evidence. The low levels of serotonin or the high levels of dopamine could actually be an effect of having OCD rather than the cause. Furthermore, not all OCD sufferers respond to SSRI treatment, so there must be other factors that play a role, and therefore this explanation is limited because no firm conclusions can be made on the cause. And then finally, whilst many neural mechanisms have been identified, they're not always present in all OCD cases. Brain scans so far have failed to identify the link between another part of the brain, the basal ganglia, and people with OCD. So there might be other factors involved. Again, similar to this point here about serotonin, what came first, the chicken or the egg? What came first, the damage to the brain or the OCD? Did the OCD cause the damage to the brain, or did the damage to the brain cause the OCD? That's something that is not quite clear. So again, an incomplete explanation of OCD. And it's possible that the changes in the brain are an effect rather than a cause. So that's the explanation of OCD complete. The genetic and neural explanations. The final part of OCD you need to know, drug therapy. So this is an opportunity to pause the video. I'd like you to draw out a synapse. I'd like you to label it with as much detail as you can so that you can understand how drug therapy works. In 5 seconds, we will look at a drawing of a synapse. So here's a very basic level drawing of a synapse. Hopefully you've got something similar where you have got neurotransmitters, you've got receptor sites on the postsynapse, you've got the gap to show the synapse, and you understand that the synapse is the end of the axon on one neuron and the receptors are on the dendrite of the next neuron. So the reason that's important is because drug therapy works on the idea that there's a chemical imbalance in the brain. A chemical imbalance meaning a neurotransmitter imbalance, specifically of serotonin, which is why the treatment is SSRIs, standing for selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. And if you break those words down, you'll really understand why and how they work. They are selective with serotonin reuptake inhibitors. They prevent the reabsorption, the reuptake of serotonin. So they increase serotonin in the synapse. And so serotonin continues to send messages in the brain, and therefore increased levels lead to less OCD symptoms. So if we look at this diagram here, what we've got is serotonin in the vesicles, in the presynapse, entering the synapse and binding to the postsynapse. Now what SSRIs do is they bind to the presynapse, to the transporter proteins on the presynapse, to prevent the neurotransmitters going back into the presynapse, because that's what happens. That's what they're supposed to do. They're supposed to get recycled. Serotonin gets recycled back into the presynapse so that it can come out, send messages again. But in someone with OCD, if their brain does not have enough serotonin, SSRIs that drug, you ingest it, and what it causes is for the transporter proteins to be blocked on the presynapse, which causes the neurotransmitters to have to bind to the receptor sites on the postsynapse and continue that message. So here's a little summary of how SSRIs work for you. So SSRIs prevent the reuptake of serotonin. So these are your important words. They block the transporter protein on the presynaptic neuron. So they make more serotonin available in the synapse, meaning that the postsynaptic neuron is more likely to fire because that serotonin continues to send the message to the postsynapse, and it leads to an increase of serotonin in the brain. So because OCD is associated with low serotonin levels, it leads to a reduction in these symptoms, for example, a reduction in being hypervigilant. So that's how SSRIs work. It's important that you use the words reuptake, transporter proteins, blocking, synapse, and increasing serotonin. With that in mind, time to consider some strengths and weaknesses of using drugs, using antidepressants, SSRIs to treat OCD. So you've got 5 seconds, pause the video, jot down your ideas, and we'll go through the answers. Okay, so we've got drug therapy being effective, and we have looked at this research earlier on in the video by Sumro that found SSRIs are more effective than a placebo. Therefore, drugs are an effective treatment of OCD. However, drugs are palliative, and that means they treat the symptoms, not the cause. They do not address the underlying cause of OCD. They simply just increase levels of serotonin to reduce the anxiety and the compulsions in a person. So a review of studies concluded that actually cognitive and behavioural therapies were more effective than drugs. So drugs might not actually be the optimum treatment for OCD. However, drugs are cheap in comparison to those treatments because thousands of tablets can be made in the time it takes for just one therapy session. So they're very good value for money for the NHS. They are a popular treatment for OCD, so actually they are really beneficial, and they're not disruptive to patients' lives. They don't have to attend appointments. They don't have to worry about attending an appointment or speaking to an individual. They can just take a tablet, and that can allow them to function day to day. However, there are very nasty side effects. Things like weight gain or dry mouth or sexual dysfunction and loss of memory, which could actually stop them from taking the drugs altogether and limit the effectiveness. SSRIs are also known to increase the risk of suicidal thoughts and self-harm in young people. So it's not appropriate for everyone, so you can't just suggest everyone takes OCD. And finally, a lot of the research, a lot of the evidence into drug treatments isn't actually reliable or trustworthy because they're funded through marketing, and drug companies will not publish results if they do not suggest that if they're not very effective or they cause harmful side effects. That data won't get published, and so we can't actually trust the data that is supplied. So we don't have very reliable evidence into drug treatments, which is obviously a concern. So that concludes the video on OCD. Thank you for watching. I hope you found it useful.